Welcome to Shadowed Tales Archive. Tonight, we invite you to descend into darkness with a chilling anthology of horror stories, each one inspired by true events. This is episode 1. Let the nightmare begin. The Hush Game. Have you ever wondered why we see ghosts? Maybe they have a message for us. Perhaps they're trapped somewhere between our world and theirs, oblivious to the fact that time has gone on without them. There have been tales of long-lost family members visiting us in our dreams and unexplainable coincidences that put a smile on your face. But for every heartwarming story of visits from the other side, there is a frightening account of an unwelcome presence that can send a chill down your spine. I could share a number of instances where I felt uneasy or even frightened by what I knew was an angry or negative spirit. However, the story I'm about to share is one that has cast a dark cloud over my nightmares for over 17 years. I can just short of guarantee that this story will force even the non-believers to check that dark corner before drifting off to dreamland. I was 11 years old the first time I saw her. My parents were away for the evening, and I had ordered Scream on pay-per-view. I haven't watched a PPV movie in a long time, but back then it would play the movie on a 24-hour loop once ordered. Well into the second viewing, I got up from the couch to grab a drink from the kitchen. I was headed for the stairs when I saw a shadow out of the corner of my eye. Hesitating for a moment, I took a deep breath and continued toward the stairway. Returning to the basement, the air seemed ominous. The room seemed darker. As I relaxed on my seat to watch the rest of my movie before bed, I saw what appeared as a strange silhouette standing near the bathroom door. I focused my full sight on what I thought was there. I blinked, and it was gone. Boy, was this movie giving me the creeps. Then I heard it, the soft whisper of a young girl at first, followed by a much louder command. "Let's play." Now, I have 2 older brothers, so I flipped on the light, expecting to see them playing a trick on me with a flashlight and a tape recorder or something. These are the same brothers who used to hide a toy record player in my room, blaring train sounds, and throw me in with the lights off, holding the doorknob so I couldn't get out. Needless to say, teasing me during a horror movie would not have been above them. With the lights now on, I yelled, "Kai, Liam, stop it or I'm telling Mom." Silence. I figured I was just overtired. I curled up on the couch and felt my eyelids getting heavier as I finished watching my movie. Just before I drifted off, I heard Kai's bedroom door creak. I dismissed it, too tired to get myself worked up over nothing. I then got the sense something was watching me. I tried to shake it off. I just wanted to sleep. Finally, I heard something breathing heavily and slowly. At first I thought it was me and that I was psyching myself out, so I held my breath for a moment. Nothing. Swearing off slasher movies forever, I turned to face the back of the couch, hoping that would help me get to sleep. "Can you play now?" The question came from lips that couldn't have been further than a few feet from the couch. Still turned, I yelled, "I'm gonna tell Mom if you guys don't leave me alone." Within seconds, Kai and Liam were at the landing by the back door. "What the hell are you screeching about?" Kai asked, he and Liam not the least bit concerned about the panic on my face. "If you guys don't stop, I'm telling Mom when she gets home." As I spoke, I knew there was no way they could have been both places at once. The realization that my brothers were upstairs all night left me cold. I stood up from the couch and quickly marched upstairs to my room, praying I could just fall asleep and put this whole thing behind me. Unfortunately, I wasn't so lucky. 30 minutes into my restless shuffling, I was alerted to the sound of my bedroom door opening ever so gently. Jolting upward from my bed and opening my eyes, I became frozen as I saw, in the corner, a young girl with long, black hair, around the age of 6, in a once white nightgown. She stared at me with dark, unblinking eyes and a wide smile. It was the kind of smile that you muster up for family picture day. In the sense I could tell it was for show. I began to open my mouth, hoping to scream or cry, anything that might scare her away. Before I could make my decision, she pulled her bony finger up to her still, smiling mouth. "Chill. Now it's my turn to hide." I yelled louder than I had ever yelled in my life. To my surprise, my mom came running into my room. "Honey, what's wrong?" she asked as I darted my eyes between her and the now empty corner of my bedroom. I couldn't answer. Was it a nightmare? Was my mind playing tricks on me? One thing was for sure. It was over. I shrugged it off as an all-too-real bad dream and went out to sleep on the couch in the living room. Fast forward about 3 weeks. It was around 10:30 and I was out playing Spot with Liam and nearly a dozen other neighborhood kids. For those of you wondering, Spot is a game of hide-and-seek played at night with flashlights. The rules were simple. We had to stay within our block. We weren't to go into backyards without permission, and you couldn't stay in one place for more than 5 minutes. I had been gearing up for this evening's game all week. I had the perfect hiding spot, and nobody would ever think to look there. Our next-door neighbors had a split-level house with a red deck off of the kitchen upstairs and plenty of room underneath for storage. Their yard wasn't fenced in, so it had easy access. I made my way under the deck and positioned myself behind their lawnmower. No way anyone will find me here, I thought. I had been crouched for around 3 minutes when I saw the beam of light coming from between the houses. My friend, Noah, was it? And he was running with his flashlight, nearing my hiding spot. Without hesitation, he turned at the edge of the house, shined the light directly on me, and yelled, "Spot!" There's no way he knew I was there. "How did you do that? Did Liam tell you about my hiding spot?" As I asked the question, I could tell he was paying little attention to me while he searched the area. "Where did she go?" Noah asked, a little hesitant. "I've been chasing her for half a block, and I just watched her duck under this deck." I couldn't tell if he was trying to play a trick on me or if he was being genuine. Although I didn't want to know the answer, I asked, "What was she wearing?" As he answered, I felt a rush of cold all the way up my back, as if someone had splashed me with ice water. She had a long, kind of grayish pajama shirt on. It was really strange. Must be somebody's little sister. I leapt out from underneath the deck and stared at him for several seconds, reading his expressions. "Noah, I've been under here this whole time, and you're the first person I've seen." With the small amount of light from his flashlight illuminating only a portion of his face, I watched his color fade. "Whatever. This game's for babies anyway. I'm going home," he stated, visibly shaken, but doing his best to keep his composure. "You're it now." He shoved the flashlight into my chest and walked quickly in the direction of his house. Although Noah was gone, I had a sudden awareness that I was not alone. Doing my best to avert my eyes from my once great hiding place, I pointed my flashlight back toward the street. My legs struggled to lift my feet. It was as if hands had emerged from the soft ground and clasped their menacing fingers around my ankles. In a desperate attempt to run, my legs had a different plan as I crashed face first into the wet grass. I lied on the ground, stunned for what felt like only a few seconds. Gathering my wits, I lifted my head to see bare, pale feet resting only inches from my nose. "Ah!" I screamed, suddenly sitting but leaning back on my hands. I had no words. That girl, the same one from my room, was standing over me. What once had been a vacant grin was replaced with a disgusting, angry snarl. That was in my hiding spot. Her voice now a high-pitched shriek, like thick nails on a dirty classroom chalkboard. Her shadowed eyes pierced through me like a hot blade as she began to cry. She continued with a much quieter, more sinister tone. "It's your fault." It was at that moment I knew she wasn't talking about the game anymore. She lunged forward, flailing her arms while she fell on top of me. I struggled to grab at her frozen wrists and hollered for anyone close who might be able to come help me. I caught one last glimpse of those sinister eyes before everything went black. I awoke to the sound of footsteps creeping up to me. "I'm sorry," I proclaimed, weak and covered in sweat. Just then a hand reached down and grabbed my arm. It was Liam. "Are you okay?" he asked. "Everyone is going home now. We didn't know where you were, and it's getting late." As I stood up, I realized I wasn't in our neighbor's backyard anymore. I had somehow managed to end up in my own driveway, just a few feet from the front steps. Are you hurt? What happened? My brother was beginning to show worry at my lack of response. I don't know. I stood there, still puzzled at how I had come to be in the driveway. Well, we'd better go in. It's almost midnight, Liam continued. Wait, what? The words left my mouth, and I began to grow more and more concerned as to what might have happened after I blacked out. I had to tell him. There was a good chance he would think I was crazy, but I couldn't keep this to myself anymore. I saw this girl. The front porch light came on, and our dad stepped outside. He didn't have to say anything. We knew it was time to come in. The nightmare started that night. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling for hours and doing my best not to look anywhere else when I felt my eyelids getting heavy. With each flutter, I could picture her face, staring at me with that look of hatred and disgust. I fought the fatigue for as long as I could, finally succumbing to the night. They say you only remember bits and pieces of dreams and lose sight of what little you had as time marches on. But the horrors that plagued my subconscious for the next several nights are still as vivid and frightening as they were 17 years ago, reappearing every now and then as not to let me forget. My first dream started out normal enough. I was with a couple of friends who have asked to remain nameless, and we were headed to an area near our house we all called Cherry Hill. It spanned several blocks and housed lots of trees, trails, hills, and even an old train trestle. We did all sorts of stuff there. We built forts, rode bikes, played tag, the stuff you'd expect kids to do. We were walking down the trail, boards and tools in hand, looking for just the right spot to build. Settling on an area tucked in by the trestle, we got to work. I was nailing some small boards to a tree to make a ladder leading up to a long ledge. It was to be our lookout. I could hear my friends digging some kind of hole behind me. After a while, the sound of their shovels stopped. That same chill I had felt under the deck was inching up my legs, to my back, then to my neck. I whipped around to see that they were gone. In fact, everything was gone. The shovels, the hole. It was as if they had never been there at all. It had gotten very dark. The giant trees were blocking any trace of light shining from the evening sky. As I strained my eyes to scan the area, I locked in on a familiar nightgown across the small stream of murky water. I was panicked, frozen in fear. I watched as she grew closer, never moving her limbs. She threw her head back in a disgusting cackle befitting a woman while her senior. I closed my eyes, hoping that would somehow slow my pounding heartbeat. Silence. I wasn't ready to open my eyes. My mind was racing, and I couldn't decide if I was awake or asleep. Before I had a chance to come to any conclusion, I felt a soft tug on my wrist. They're gone now. Will you play with me? It was that same soft voice I had heard in my basement. It wasn't creepy or angry. If I had to think of a word for it, I would say it almost sounded scared. No longer feeling threatened, I was ready to open my eyes. What a horrible mistake. She stood only inches from me, covered in blood, but with no visible wounds. Through the gore, I could see the frills of her gown, now torn and crimson. The more frightened I became, the more pleased she seemed with herself. Turning to run, I had made it only a few steps before tripping and crashing into the cold dirt. I had to compose myself. I sat up and glanced at the object that forced me to topple over. Oh my God, no. The words left my mouth as I stumbled back even further. There, laid out in a heaping mess, were my friends. Next to them was a shovel, covered in blood and hair. She stood over the bodies, that menacing grin returning to her face, and she slowly brought her finger up to her lips. Shoo! I awoke on the living room couch. I know I fell asleep on my own bed, but with a history of sleepwalking, I wasn't surprised. One thing was for certain. I wasn't going back to sleep. I turned on the TV and watched infomercials until morning. I finally got up to make myself a bowl of cinnamon toast crunch as the rest of the family emerged from their rooms. I wanted to tell them what was happening to me, but I was sort of famous in our house for stupid nightmares. To this day, I still catch guff about the big green duck with a machine gun that would chase me around the neighborhood. Nobody was going to take me seriously. I had to find a way to handle this on my own. That night before bed, I knelt down next to my bed and I locked my hands together in prayer. Dear Lord, I need your help. There is something evil here that won't leave me alone. I don't know why it would choose me. Did I do something wrong? I beg of you, Lord, please stop this. I will never ask you for anything ever again. Amen. I was dream-free for the next 2 nights. Maybe there was something to this prayer thing. It was Saturday, and a few of us had gotten together for a game of street hockey. We must have played for at least 2 hours before someone said, "Let's go to Cherry Hill." As soon as I heard it, that cold chill raced up my back. I think I'm going to stay here, guys. They weren't having that. After lots of prodding and pleading, we hopped on our bikes. We stayed near the entrance, making dangerous ramps out of leftover boards from our hockey goals. I wasn't that excited about going toward the trestle, but I figured there was strength in numbers. We were pointing out spots that would be ideal for a new fort. "There's a good spot," I said, pointing to a wall of dirt with an area already dug out. I was quickly outvoted, as it was clear someone else had already claimed that area. We ventured down the trail until we neared the old trestle. "This spot is too open." I pled my case and hoped for the best. It must have been let's do the opposite of what I want to do day, because everyone ignored me and headed down toward the water. Not wanting to let my fears get the best of me, I followed. I walked toward the lookout ledge from my dream. It was as if something was pulling me in that direction. Glancing at the tree, I noticed letters etched out in the bark. They spelled out one word: chill. I was done. No more fort building for me. I jumped on my bike and sped home. I was still shaking when I pulled into the driveway. I refused to come to the door when a couple of my friends stopped over to check on me. I lied in bed, sobbing and cursing the ceiling. "Why won't you help me? I begged for your help, and you didn't listen." I cried myself to sleep. My next nightmare was much shorter. It was a very strange dream in that I felt like I was watching a slideshow. I remember watching an old, rundown farmhouse slowly fall to a pile of junk, but it was in pictures, with each one showing more age and decay. There was a tree in the front yard with a tire swing, and in every image there were children running around and playing. They didn't seem fazed by the crumbling house behind them. As the house aged, fewer kids were seen running around, until only one remained. I watched as the last little girl stared at the ground, sad that her friends had left her. I watched her sadness turn to anger, and then into resentment. The background grew dark, and her eyes met mine. The edges of her mouth turned up into that all-too-familiar grin. She knew I was watching her. She stood still for several minutes, as the wind blew through the bare trees behind her. Suddenly, everything went dark, and I heard the whisper, "What should we play next?" I avoided my room for the next several nights, finding any reason I could stay up well past my bedtime, although I feared coming across her while I was alone in the dark. It somehow felt safer than meeting her in a dream. She could manipulate me in my nightmares. I couldn't look away. I tried obscene amounts of Mountain Dew, bright lights from the TV, and music to avoid surrender to the night. I finally figured out that if I slept during the day, she left me alone. I still wonder to this day if she was fueled by my fear. I was calmed by the light of day. It kept me safe. I had nearly forgotten all about her by the time she visited me again. Weeks had passed, and I had started sleeping in my bed again. This final encounter was by far the creepiest. I consider this my final encounter because I truly believe any dreams since then have been residual, albeit terrifying. I awoke to the wind blowing my curtains across my face. This was significant because I have terrible allergies and am unable to sleep with the windows open. As soon as my eyes opened, I could hear faint laughter coming from the front yard. It almost sounded like the overused laugh track that goes with any clip of children playing in movies and television. I attempted to sit up and quickly realized I had no control of my own movements. I felt paralyzed. Before long, I was lifted out of bed and placed, standing on my bedroom floor. I began walking toward the window, still unable to move my own limbs. At the screen, I watched as this beautiful little girl skipped and sang through the grass without notice of the world around her. This time, I didn't feel as if she knew I was there. Mesmerized for nearly a full minute, I finally snapped out of it to find I was no longer in my own room. From my surroundings, I could tell that this bedroom belonged to a girl. The walls were covered in bright pinks, purples, and yellows, with tons of princess dollhouses, Barbies, and dresses scattered along the floor and in the open closet. I stood in the middle of the room, still unable to move, and watched as the door flew open and that same little girl from the front yard came running in, crying. When she dashed by me without looking, I didn't think that she could see me. Had I become a ghost? The girl jumped into the closet and her eyes locked onto mine. As footsteps grew louder down the hall, she looked at me, put her finger up to her mouth, and gave a soft, "Chill." Who was she hiding from? Why was she crying? I stood and watched as a tall man wearing a baseball cap, red t-shirt, and jeans marched into the room with a menacing, come out, wherever you are." The little girl kept her stare on me as tears rolled down her face. I tried to ask him who he was looking for, but he didn't respond. Couldn't he see me? His tone quickly changed. Where the hell did that beat *H go? I still couldn't tell if he knew I was there, but I knew she must be hiding for a reason, so I decided to keep my mouth shut. He gave one last look around the room and left. I watched him walk down the hallway until I could no longer see him, and when I turned to the closet, she was gone. In the blink of an eye, all of the room's bright colors turned to shades of gray. I heard shouts coming from another room in the house. Without hesitation, I ran toward the screams. When I got into the living room, the little girl was lying on the floor. This time, she was wearing that same nightgown from my earlier visions. The man in the ball cap was standing over her, and I could tell that she was uncomfortable. "Let's play a game, sweetie. It's called the quiet game." Although his words were sweet, I knew his intentions were anything but. She was terrified. Her eyes were telling a story of fear and sadness. I panicked. "Leave her alone." I yelled the words as loudly as I could. I'm not sure what I was expecting to happen, but my shouts fell on deaf ears. It was no use. She turned again to look at me, and I began to feel lightheaded, like I was losing oxygen. Everything went dark, but I could still hear the faint cries of a scared little girl. The cries were followed by wet, gurgling sounds, and that's when I heard the sound that still gives me chills as I write these words, as if he was right by my face. I heard the man whisper one last request. "Chill." I woke up right after that and sobbed in my bed for what seemed like hours. Aside from the occasional nightmare, I haven't seen the little girl since. Although I haven't seen her, I still feel like she's around. I've spent time in libraries and news archives, hoping to come across a story of a familiar missing girl, or maybe even something on the man in the cap. I believe my dream of the deteriorating house means the potential scene of the crime is long gone. I suppose it's best that I leave it be. But the question I fear will forever go unanswered is, was I just a kid with an overactive imagination, or was a frightened little girl reaching out for help that I failed to provide? Sweet dreams. Whispers by the Willow. I'm writing this because my family won't talk about it anymore. I'm the only one who can't seem to forget. I was raised on the outskirts of Preston, a small town in southern Idaho with a population of around 5,000. My more immediate community was an isolated, dead-end dirt road called Bear Creek. Less than 20 families lived on Bear Creek. I didn't mind being so isolated. I grew up in the comfort of wide fields and close neighbors that only rural people know. We were a Mormon community, very church-centered, very community-centered. All the young girls, myself included, were part of the young women's group. And all of the boys were members of the local Boy Scout troop, which doubled as a church group in our area. We had 4th of July parties at the local ballpark and swam in the nearby reservoir. It was a good, quiet community. My house, a 92-year-old farmhouse built by my great-great-grandfather, was situated on a small hill surrounded by a wide grass field on one side and a snaking dirt road on the other. Across the road was the creek bottoms. Southern Idaho is categorized in a desert climate, so not much grows outside of the irrigated fields besides sagebrush and burrs. The creek bottoms were the exception. The creek fed the growth of a thick tangle of pussy willow bushes. In the late fall, we used to go down into the bottoms and pick the white, cottony pussy willow seeds to decorate the fences of our driveway. Being so isolated, it wasn't uncommon for animals to come down from the mountains. We had a female moose who brought her calf down and lived in our orchard every winter. And the occasional lion wasn't unheard of either. The summer when I turned 8, I remember because it was the same year as my baptism, a smaller mountain lion was spotted several times in our area. We weren't worried. The big cats stayed away from the farms and usually moved on when the area didn't yield enough food. That same summer, my neighbor Caleb was working on his Eagle Scout project. He loved National Geographic and thought it would be pretty cool to try putting together a National Geographic submission on our little creek bottoms. The young lion that happened to be in our area at the same time made him especially excited. He decided he wanted to try and get pictures of the lion and emailed the National Geographic team for advice. They recommended setting up an automatic camera that takes shots every couple of seconds in an area the lion was known to visit. They also recommended setting some kind of bait so the lion was more likely to come by. No one in the creek liked the idea of live bait or carrion, so we came up with a different kind of bait. We decided to set up an audio recording of a dying rabbit and play it on a loop through a set of speakers hidden in the willows. I remember when everyone was down in the bottoms testing the speakers, and I heard the noise for the first time. The sound of a dying rabbit is horrible. It's been described as being almost identical to the sound of a screaming child. If you've never heard it yourself, there's plenty of recordings available online. It's worth a listen. The camera was set up. The speakers were set up. Everything was perfect. Caleb explained that he would allow the camera and recording to play uninterrupted for a week, and then he would go check on it. This would give time for our scent to fade from the bottoms and encourage the lion to come closer. At first, I was worried about the noise. It was a truly horrible noise, and our house was the closest to the setup point in the bottoms. My father, Tom, assured me that the noise wouldn't reach as far as our house, and I was relieved when we arrived home that night, and he was correct. The bottoms were far enough away that I couldn't hear anything. I remember Caleb the next day at church. He was fidgety and excited to check on the equipment, but he had to wait a week, which everybody kept reminding him. He couldn't risk going down too early and scaring the lion away for good. That night, I woke up to an awful noise. I sat ramrod straight in my bed with my eyes wide in the dark. Hands clutched so hard my palms bore the indent of my fingernails for hours after. I knew that noise. It was the recording of the rabbit. It sounded faint and far off, like it really could have been coming from the bottoms. But that was impossible, because the recording had been going all night the previous day and I hadn't heard a thing. I didn't sleep that night. I was too scared to get out of bed and wake my parents. The recording played over and over again. I had the loop memorized. In the morning, I stumbled into the kitchen for breakfast. My mom and dad were sitting at the kitchen table. They too had dark rings under their eyes. I hadn't been the only one who'd heard it. Karen was convinced that the equipment must have been broken. She wanted to go down into the bottoms to check it out. Tom refused. He was a kind, gentle man and didn't want to stir up any unnecessary drama. He was sure there had been a strong wind last night, and the wind was carrying the noise farther than its natural reach. He told us to listen. We did. He was right. We couldn't hear it now. We forgot about it and went about our daily goings. The next night, it happened again. I stayed up in bed with my back to the wall. The screaming was even louder than before, but this time something was different. It was lower pitched than I remember, and parts of the loop were slowed down, as if the recording were warped in places. At times the loop did not loop naturally, and instead picked up at a random place in the middle. Karen didn't mention anything at the breakfast table, but both her and Tom seemed tense. The third night, I mustered the courage to stand beside my bedroom window and look out into the yard. For a moment I stood, rooted to the spot, my hands shaking no matter how hard I clenched them. The noise sidled in through the cracks in the window. I watched the outline of the trees in the yard, perfectly still. Not even the slightest breeze stirred their branches. Karen announced that she would be going to visit her sisters in town the next day and would probably spend the night there. She invited me to come along, but I was a daddy's girl at heart and chose to stay at the farm. I took her place beside Tom in their bed that night, but even that didn't help. I don't think my dad was asleep either, for he was unnaturally still the whole night. We began to hear the noise during the day too. I was drawing with chalk on the sidewalk when it happened. My shoulders tensed and the hairs on the back of my neck prickled. There was only one scream, a short, high-pitched one, and then the recording fell silent. It happened again several times throughout the day, but never the whole loop. Just clips from it. Later that evening, Caleb's dad, Mr. Granger, came up the driveway on his four-wheeler. He said he was looking for their dog, a sweet yellow lab who had been missing since that morning. Tom said he was sorry and that we hadn't seen her. I stared at him, silently begging him to mention the recording. But he didn't. He was a quiet man after all. He didn't want to bring up any unnecessary drama. Karen stayed away the whole week. Tom and I didn't sleep. By Saturday, the screaming could be heard constantly, though it seemed to have deviated from the familiar loop entirely. I didn't recognize any of it. Sometimes the screams were thin and long. Other times they were hardly more than growls. Once, while my dad had been heating up meatloaf for lunch, the noise rose into such a rancorous din that he dropped the plate and it shattered. I pressed my hands over my ears where I sat at the table and squeezed my eyes shut, but it didn't help. The noise forced its way in through the cracks of my fingers and pinched my throat and rattled in my ribcage. The din lasted for a whole minute, then fell silent. Tom was shaking. That was the last we heard of the noise that day. Caleb came by Saturday evening to ask permission to cross our road to collect the equipment. He was so excited. I watched him disappear into the creek bottoms with a sense of tired relief. After the equipment was gone, it would all stop. I couldn't wait to get a full night's sleep. Not a minute later, I spotted Caleb coming back up from the creek. I was confused. It had taken us much longer to set up the camera and speakers, so I'd only assumed it would take just as long to collect them. My breath stilled when Caleb came closer. He didn't look right. His eyes were wide and his face pale. Something wet dribbled from his chin and onto his shirt. I later realized it was vomit. Tom caught him before he fell and demanded to know what had happened. Caleb couldn't speak. He just cried. We called his dad. I looked after Caleb as both Tom and Mr. Granger went into the bottoms. They were gone a long time. When they returned, their faces were grim, and they smelled funny. I noticed red on my dad's hands. I asked what was wrong, but they brushed right past me and immediately called the police. Nobody would tell me what had happened. I sat on the couch as a blur of neighbors and police officers swirled around me. At one point, an officer placed something on the kitchen table and left. I looked into the kitchen curiously. It was the camera from the bottoms. I wish I hadn't looked. The camera was a little banged up. Tiny scratches and dents covered the plastic casing. When I lifted it, my hand stuck to the plastic. Something tacky and odorous covered the screen, but turned on fine. The first set of photos were normal. Just the pussy willows cast green in the glow of the night setting. As I continued to click through them, they quickly became strange. At one point, the camera angle changed, as if the camera had been knocked from its post. Grass now obscured most of the frame. Flecks of red appeared on the lens and remained for the rest of the sets. One photo made me pause. There was a figure in this one, or half of a figure, as most of the upper torso hadn't made it into the frame. I thought it could be human, but it didn't look like it should be standing upright. Its legs were twisted like an animal, and it seemed to be having difficulty supporting itself in an upright position. Beside the legs, a long, thin arm hung. Whatever it was must have been stooped over, for its fingertips hung below its crooked knees. The next set was different. It was as if the camera had been picked up and was now being held. The first photo was of the bottoms at night. The next startled me. I had to look closely before deciding what it was. A rabbit had been laid in the bushes. but its ears and most of its scalp had been peeled away. The next was of the same rabbit, but a thin, dark hand was holding it up against the sky. Its limp body hung like something from a nightmare. In the following photos, more rabbits joined the one, each with their ears and scalp removed. Then a cat, then more cats, then a dog, the yellow lab, then the lion. The following photo was of 7 rabbits, 3 cats, 1 dog, and a lion, all laid out in a row facing the same way. Their arms and legs had been arranged as if they were marching, like some parade. All of their scalps had been removed, and tiny white glints of their skulls could be seen. The last photo was overly bright, like the photo had been taken too close with the flash on. An eye dominated the frame, but it was yellowed and crusty and had a bar pupil like a horse. In the bottom corner, the edge of a mouth could be seen. No lips, just teeth, sharp and little, with wide gaps of red gum between them. I wish I hadn't looked. I heard my dad talking to the police outside. They said the speakers had malfunctioned. The recording had only played the first night. Whispers in the steam. A couple important things to note before I tell you about my experience. You're more than welcome to go check this place out for yourselves. Do a quick Google search of Diamond Fork Hot Springs, Utah, and you'll get hundreds of results telling you exactly how to get there. For those of you that are curious, it is about an hour-and-a-half drive from Salt Lake City. I would not, however, recommend that you go by yourself or at night. Another important thing to know is that where my experience took place and the land surrounding it has a significant history, especially related to Native Americans. Unfortunately, much of the recorded history is about the exceptionally bloody conflicts between these Native Americans and early settlers. Just a couple examples are Black Hawk's War, the Provo War, and the Walker War. I also wish it to be known that I am quite fond of Native Americans and what I know of their culture. I have absolutely nothing against them. In fact, I have several close friends that have Native American heritage. I do not mean to offend or accuse by telling my experience. I mention this side note only because of the possible link between my experience and various legends about so-called skinwalkers. I will provide the facts, and you can make of it what you'd like. That being said, the Diamond Fork Hot Springs are a gem. They are nestled a good half an hour drive and subsequent hike up the canyon and away from the city. I had been there several times before my wife Elena, and I decided to take a Monday off and hike there again this past winter. The springs are quite popular, and during the summer they tend to draw a large crowd of college students, scout troops, and old men that are overly fond of publicly bathing nude. I had gone in the winter with my cousin several years previous, and at that point, we had the springs to ourselves. So I convinced Elena to spend one of her days off hiking to them with me. January 11th, 2016. We began our hike just before 1 p.m., thinking that this would give us ample time to hike to the springs, enjoy soaking for a couple of hours, and get back to the car before sundown. I had hiked to the springs in the winter before, and knew that each winter the road is blocked off to cars well before the trail to the springs begins. This is due to snow, though honestly, it seemed to me like it wouldn't be hard for a plow to go the additional 4-ish miles. I guess I forgot just how far 4 miles is when you're walking through snow and ice. Nevertheless, we walked through the gate. The road was still open to hikers and snowshoers, and began our hike. We enjoyed ourselves and took breaks about every 30 minutes. Each break we thought, the trailhead must be around the next bend in the road. Shortly before our first break, I noticed a hole, cave would be too generous a term, in the side of the mountain to the left of us. It was obviously a man-made hole, as it was covered by a section of chain-link fence. Still, it perked my curiosity. It was only about 30 feet from the trail, so I told Elena I'd like to check it out, and she happily came up with me. Upon further investigation, we found that it was not much more than a boring hole. We used our flashlights to shine as far back into the hole as we could, but all we could see was some abandoned piping. After taking another 5-minute break, we continued on further into the canyon. We walked and walked and walked. The time wore on, and, much earlier than we would have liked, our feet began to ache. I was beginning to regret insisting that we go on this adventure when finally we turned around a bend and saw the bridge that marks the trailhead. With newfound energy, we rushed over to the sign with information about the various trails. At this point, it was about 3 p.m., and I was beginning to become a bit concerned about having enough light to make it back before sundown. But we were already this far, and we weren't going to turn around before spending at least some time soaking in those springs. Plus, we had flashlights just in case. And the way back to the car, albeit lengthy, was very straightforward. So we pushed forward, knowing that we were well over halfway there. Our strength seemed to diminish at an exponential rate, which was concerning because we'd have over a 5-mile hike back to the car. But I knew that we'd make it back somehow, perhaps with more frequent breaks than on the way up. We soon began to smell the sulfur odor that was a sure sign we were getting very close. We ended up seeing some bikers as we approached the springs. They were riding some of those fat bikes that have huge tires and are designed for the snow. We were happy to see them coming towards us, as this meant they were leaving, and we would probably have the springs to ourselves. After letting them pass, we hiked another 10 minutes or so and finally reached the springs. I cannot explain how heavenly of sight those springs were. The combination of the milky blue water, the red rock with snow on it to our left and our right, the blue sky above, and the waterfall about 100 yards ahead. It was too much to take in at once. And best of all, we had it all to ourselves. We quickly stripped down to our swimming suits and hopped in. It felt incredible, truly like stepping into healing waters. We relaxed for a bit, and our noses quickly adjusted to the sulfur smell. Unfortunately, our bodies also adjusted to the water temperature, and before long, the water didn't feel as amazingly warm as it did at first. There are a few places between the first spring and the waterfall further along the trail where water bubbles out of the earth and flows into a pool of its own. So I figured I'd check out a couple of the other pools and see if I could find a hotter one. I managed to climb up the runoff of some of the other pools, thinking that this would save my feet from freezing. It did, but in the process, my feet slipped several times on the mossy rocks and were fairly banged up by the time I reached the other pools. To my delight, these pools were significantly warmer. So I rushed back and beckoned Elena to come join me in these warmer springs. After a very brisk 30-second dash, we jumped in, and I yelped briefly as I realized I may have jumped a bit too close to the mouth of the spring. We soaked and enjoyed ourselves for about an hour. We ate some of the chips and granola bars that we had packed in, and I downed a good deal of cherry Coke. Perfect drink for a hike, right? At this point, I had accepted the fact that for at least some of the hike back, we would be in darkness and have to use our flashlights. From the springs, it was hard to tell just how much the sun had set, since there are mountains rising steeply to both the east and the west. And the sun is only visible overhead for around 5 hours in the middle of the day. At about 5 p.m., we decided we really needed to get going. As much as we were dreading the hike back, we dried off, took a few pictures, and headed out. Shortly after beginning the hike back, I realized that my feet were immensely sore and that my legs were already begging for a break. I mentioned this to Elena, and she said she was feeling the same. I could tell that we were both in a mood to complain, so I determined to try and keep the mood light and the conversation lively to distract us from our discomfort. Things got very dark very fast. We hadn't even reached the halfway point from the springs to the main road when we started seeing stars above us. We had a couple of flashlights with us, but I figured we should put off using them as long as we could. I had just grabbed them from my parents' house and had no idea how long they'd last. I also hadn't thought to bring extra batteries. All was well, though, as our eyes had adjusted with the darkness, and making out the snow-packed trail wasn't too difficult. I could tell that Elena was getting as tired as I was. So in an attempt to distract ourselves from our weariness, I asked her about a scary movie that she had seen with a friend a few days prior. As she told me the plot, I began to feel a bit anxious and jumpy, but nothing more than what would be expected. It was partway through Elena's explanation of the plot, though, that I felt a surreal, sinking feeling. It was as though my insides were being squeezed, and I was descending into a state of panic. I generally don't get overly scared when reading or hearing scary stories, especially if I know it's just a movie. But this was different. I determined that this must be due to our circumstances. Being isolated in the mountains, far from anyone else, with darkness surrounding us on all sides. From a beginning of the sinking feeling to attempting to justify it and brush it off was only a matter of seconds. I hadn't realized it, but Elena had paused her explanation and hiked in silence for those few seconds, then hastily wrapped it up and moved on to another subject. I was secretly glad that she had finished so quickly and figured that some discussion on a lighter topic would probably push out the overwhelming feeling of panic and paranoia that had overtaken me. It was about at this point that I began to hear the whispering. There is a river that runs next to the trail and down about 5 feet in most places, and I try to brush the noise off as the sound of rushing water. The thing that made me especially uneasy, though, was that the noise wasn't just coming from the river to the left of us. It was coming from the right, and from behind as well. Elena had gone silent again, and I hadn't paid much attention as I was quite distracted by the noises. They started out very quiet, almost too quiet to even notice over the sound of the river, and slowly grew louder. They never grew loud enough to completely get rid of the doubt that they were actually there. But I was sensing a change in Elena's disposition as well. Shortly thereafter, she said my name, which nearly made me jump out of my skin, and asked if I'd be okay taking a break. I tried to appear calm and said I would, though the feeling of panic was still as strong as ever. It seemed to scream that we needed to get away from where we were now. We sat down in the snow and didn't talk much. I think I mentioned something about how we must be getting close to the road, and that then at least we'd be on a wide paved road rather than this thin dirt trail. I didn't dare ask Elena if she was feeling or hearing anything, in part because I didn't want to sound like the scary movie plot was getting to me, and more in part because I didn't want her to confirm that the weird stuff going on wasn't just inside my head. Unfortunately, the whisperings hadn't stopped while we rested. In fact, they seemed more real than ever. I was getting antsy and again anxious to at least be making our way towards our car and sure safety. I suppose it was more a desire to be making our way away from whatever was behind or around us. At this point, I began to shiver, and pointing this out to Elena, I suggested we keep pushing onward. I knew that I wasn't too cold, at least not cold enough to make me shiver like I was. Put simply, I was overwhelmingly terrified of the darkness around us and what it contained. We hopped up and continued onward. All the time, I was hoping and praying that we would see the bridge marking the trailhead, and at least make it off of this dirt trail and back onto pavement. I knew that we would have a several-mile walk back to the car after crossing the bridge, but there was something comforting about the thought of being on the wider road. As we came upon a rather steeper part of the trail, I recognized it as a landmark that was very close to the bridge. I decided we should pull out our flashlights for this portion. I didn't want either of us slipping on ice or tripping on a root and falling into the river below, and among whatever else might be down there. We each took a flashlight, and I decided to go behind Elena just in case she started sliding backwards. As we started climbing up, I looked down at the path and noticed the strange tracks that the bikes had left in the snow. I also noticed some other strange tracks that were going around and over the bike tracks. It looked like a small party of people with bare feet had gone through with a pack of large dogs. My mind was trying to put things together quickly, but was struggling. Those bikers had been the only people that we had seen, but these foot and paw prints were certainly from people that had come after the bikers. Another strange thing was that these prints were not only on the trail, but were left deep in the snow to either side, seeming to go off in random directions. Some tracks came to the trail, others left it, and everywhere there were large paw prints mixed with human footprints. At first, this came as a relief to me. My first thought was that there must be some very dedicated campers. who had decided to bring their dogs along somewhere close by. The thought of some tough, burly campers nearby in these forsaken mountains was like a ray of light to my mind. Then a point of confusion began to form. Small at first, but then very concerning. Campers don't go hiking around in the snow in bare feet. And this point was much too far from the springs for someone to be walking around without shoes. This thought process, from terrified to hopeful, back to terrified and concerned, happened within a matter of seconds. Elena had stopped and turned to me, pointing out the prints in the snow as well. I tried to brush it off with a chuckle and yeah, what the heck are people thinking? But the look of concern on her face only confirmed that I was not alone in my worried thoughts. The panic was again overcoming me, and I wished more than ever that the whispering would stop. All I could say was, "Let's go," and we pushed on with even more determination than before. I kept looking behind us, every time expecting to see something following. Each time before I looked back, my stomach would do a flip, but not once did I see anything suspicious. We kept our flashlights on for the rest of the hike out, and at long last we saw the bridge ahead. We quickly crossed it and, without a word, continued onto the main road. Roughly 4 more miles, and we would be safe and sound in the car. To my immense relief, the whisperings seemed to quiet down now that we were on the road. My legs and feet were aching like the dickens, so I asked Elena if we could take another quick break. She obliged, and I very quickly regretted making the suggestion. The river still flowed by the road, but it was not nearly as close as it was to the dirt path, and therefore didn't mask any sounds. At this point, the whispers, though quieter than they had been on the dirt trail, were very clear and undeniably existent. I stared back to the bridge, wishing that this maddening noise and accompanying sense of extreme paranoia would go away. As I looked to Elena to see how she was reacting to the menacing noise, I noticed she had her head in her hands and seemed to be shaking. I put my arm around her shoulder and pressed my head up against hers. And as I looked down, I froze. The snow we were sitting on was covered in human footprints, along with those enormous paw prints. Again, there seemed to be no method or destination in mind for whoever, whatever, had been stomping around here. I shined my flashlight with a shaky hand in each direction, trying to figure out where these things had gone. I followed one set of footprints that ascended up the side of the hill to our right, and saw that the human prints ended, and those huge animal prints picked up right where they had left off. I felt as if I was descending into madness. I wanted to cry. I began to feel angry toward these things. Was this some sick joke? I wanted to scream and call out to these things, to stop messing around, to get on with whatever they were going to do to us. More than anything, I wanted this all to end, with hot tears stinging my face. And with this newfound anger giving me a boost of energy, I pulled Elena up by her hand, and without a word, we continued at a brisk pace down the road. I could not shake the darkness. This was so much darker than anything I had experienced. It was horrible and overwhelming. Even the stars above seemed extremely dim. The darkness was pressing in all around us, above us, below us, and worst of all, it seemed to be inside us. Strange thoughts entered my mind, wondering what acts of evil could bring such a feeling to this place, wondering if we had done anything to bring this upon ourselves. Was this some sacred place that we were trespassing on? Had we done something to offend these creatures? Whatever the case, I hated this area and felt that I was beginning to give in to the evil ambient darkness that seemed to be consuming us. I want to give up. The thought entered my mind that embracing this evil might be the only way out. Elena saved me from my own thoughts. Her sweet voice pierced my dark thoughts and halted this internal spiraling. She had stopped and softly said my name. After taking a second to recover, I asked how she was holding out. She pointed off to the right, toward where her flashlight was shining on a patch of juniper bushes. Again, that invisible hand seemed to clench my stomach, and I froze momentarily. A pair of eyes were reflecting back at us. I tried to regain my composure, and after a few seconds, I noticed that the eyes remained unblinking. I quickly realized that they were that of a dead animal. The awkward angle and lack of movement gave that away. As I continued to stare, I realized that this was not just a single dead animal. There were 5 or so dead deer. And what made my stomach really churn was the amount of blood, covering a large patch of the road. I turned away as the sight made me lightheaded and shifted my focus to the ground right in front of us. Again, the snow was covered in those cursed footprints, this time painted with blood. I'll spare you the details, but let me say, it seemed that these creatures had enjoyed themselves immensely at this horrid spot, and there were several trails of blood streaking the snow. Still focusing on the ground, I led us forward and to the left around this horrible scene of carnage, averting my eyes from the worst of it. I kept expecting to encounter the smell of rotting flesh, but it never came. I guess the deer carcasses were too fresh, and the cold weather probably helped too. Soon thereafter, we passed a campground, a landmark that meant we were getting close to our blessed car. It was at this point that the hollering began. When I heard the first shout, a chill went down my whole body, and I felt sick to my stomach. This was an inhuman shout, and it wasn't far behind us. I looked back, nearly tweaking my neck in the process, but still I couldn't see anything. It was indescribably terrifying. I wished that I could see something so that at least I would know what we were up against. Anything I felt would be better than being kept in this state of knowing something was there, but not knowing what it was. We hurried forward toward the car, our legs and feet protesting every step, and the hollering seemed to grow ever closer and louder. Every 20 seconds or so, I would quickly scan to the left, right, and behind. Each time I hoped that I would see something to relieve me from this deranging state of not knowing. Still, I was terrified to the core of what I might see. Finally, after hours of wishing we were here, we rounded a bend and saw our beautiful car. Never in my life was I so happy to see it. My moment of joy was cut short, however, as I did one of my brief scans of our surroundings. Upon looking behind us, I saw several dark figures moving slowly toward us. A few had their heads raised, and I wondered what I had been thinking when I had wished that I could see what these creatures were. Each of them was human-like in form, though they were unusually tall and walking on all fours. They were all covered in thick, reddish-brown hair and had bright red eyes that reflected perfectly in the dim light of my flashlight. I will never forget those eyes. What terrified me to the very center, and still haunts me to this day, is the expression they all wore. Each that had their head up was staring right at me as they slowly crawled forward, and they were each wide-eyed, wearing a toothy grin. It felt as if they were boring inside me with their stares, and I was certain we were going to die. At this point, I wasn't afraid of death. I was instead terrified of what the alternative would be. Once they caught up to us, I could see an excitement and twisted joy in their faces, as if they were playing a favorite game of theirs, feeding off our terror. And oh, how I wish I could describe the blackness that surrounded them. It was a blackness that was felt as much as it was seen. It was horribly fascinating, almost even enticing. But those terrifying creatures were so vile that at no point did I consider moving even an inch toward them. At this point, I nearly went berserk. Luckily, Elena hadn't looked back yet and was marching faithfully on toward the car. When I finally unrooted myself from the spot and found my voice, I cried out to Elena to run and not look back. She turned to look at me and possibly behind, but I screamed, "Don't," and she seemed startled by my state of near insanity. She looked forward toward the car again, and we both sprinted straight for it, adrenaline overcoming weariness. We jumped in, slammed the doors. I fumbled with the keys and let off the clutch quicker than I intended, nearly killing the engine. The darkness seemed to be thickening by the second, as I unintentionally peeled out, flinging mud and snow all over. Elena turned around and screamed. I looked in the rearview mirror and saw the creatures, mere feet from our car. Their sick faces were ecstatic with excitement, and their wide grins made me shout and put the pedal to the floor. Soon we were zooming along the canyon at about 40 miles per hour, very dangerous for such a small, winding road. And somehow these fiends were keeping up with us. Everything about them was incredibly unnerving, from their horrible gallop to those perverted smiles. I prayed that we would reach a straightaway, where we could go faster, and perhaps by some miracle, outrun these beasts. Out of the blue, the darkness seemed to lift. The stars shone more brightly than they had all night, and I was overcome with relief. I looked in the rearview mirror and saw the creatures, now far behind us, leaping up the sides of the hills to our left. It was still a sickening sight, but somehow I knew that they were done toying with us at last. We drove in silence for several minutes, until we reached the highway. What a sweet relief it was to see other humans. Seeing the warm glow of their headlights was like walking up to a hot fire after being cold. I turned to Elena and saw that she was crying, and I in turn began to cry. We cried and hugged, but remained silent. As we sat there next to the highway, there was nothing to say at this point. Shortly after getting back on the highway, I noticed I was quite nauseous and shaky. I pulled over and threw up, and felt much better afterward. At long last, the paranoia left me, and I felt like a new person. We got home around 7:30. We turned on all the lights, shut and locked the door, and stayed up all night. Neither of us wanted to sleep, so we stayed up holding each other tight and trying to distract ourselves with movies. Neither of us talked about what we had gone through until well into the next day, when the sun was high and everything was bright. I could tell neither of us wanted to be the one to bring it up. I felt that if we talked about it, we would solidify that it really happened. But I finally brought it up, and it was almost a relief to have it out in the open. We've told a select few people about this experience, and much of it is still quite confusing to us. We still have some questions that may forever remain unanswered. What in the world were those creatures? What did we do to warrant their pursuit? They were certainly the quickest creatures we've ever seen. So why didn't they catch up to us? What would have happened if we had tried to confront them? All we know is that there is a serious evil presence up that canyon. And if you don't believe me, you know where to find it.
And that was tonight's tale from the Shadowed Tales archive. If it left a mark on your mind, if the silence feels heavier now, then the story did what it was meant to do. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share the darkness. New stories are always on their way. Until then, keep the lights low and the doors locked.